okay with me reading it to you. So Don and I just want to take a minute just to acknowledge not only the court system and, of course, what Judge Nelson did in making sure that this trial got moved forward and got to a good conclusion, but I don't think that anybody here realizes what effort was put into by the Sheriff's Office and Sanford Police Department to make sure that everything that we had to do in this case was done properly and was done in a way that ensured the safety of the community. So if you would indulge me for just a minute, you'll notice in my arguments, if not in my letters as well, I can get a bit verbose. So, dear Sheriff Esslinger, I want to take a moment to express my and my team's sincere thanks and appreciation for the way that your organization has handled the George Zimmerman matter. I also want to get this letter to you before the verdict. This was July 8th, last week, because I did not want its message to be impacted one way or the other by the eventual outcome. I know that your involvement even preceded my involvement back on April 2012, and that you used the entirety of your department's resources to properly address the reality of where this case was and the potentials of where it might go on any given day. While I understand that I am unaware of most of the work that your department has done, I'm very aware of at least some of the results. I also understand by virtue of the confidential nature of a lot of the efforts, you will never receive true recognition for the unseen work that ensured each positive result. I have what I perceive to be a unique perspective on the countywide impact of this case and your responses to it. The integrity and the dedication that you and the entire Sheriff's Office has brought to this difficult and complex situation has, in large part, helped direct it towards a more rational and peaceful unfolding. I'm not sure what the next couple of weeks may bring, but I am confident that you will continue to protect your county, its citizens, and its institutions, particularly the now often assailed judicial system. I also want to express my heartfelt gratitude for the way that you handled me and my team throughout the difficult times. The men and women of your department have treated all members of the process, from my team to the Martin family, to the prosecution, to the public, in a completely professional and respectful way. And we have done it in such an organized and seamless manner that their presence went almost completely unnoticed. What I have noticed is your department's calm certainty that they know what to do, how to do it, and how to protect all of those involved, including the process, while accomplishing their tasks. Personally, this made my job much easier because I can focus my team's efforts on the proper presentation of our case without concerns for outside influences or logistical concerns. We come to the courthouse every day knowing that you have that covered. I do not know what awards or commendations are available to acknowledge the pure perfection with which you and your department have handled the entire event, but I am certain that you have the vote of every member of my team, the prosecution team, the judicial staff, the media, and every citizen who has interacted with your department in this case. Thanks again. Anyway, I just thought that was appropriate because both Sheriff Esslinger and Sanford PD has done an amazing job in making this process as peaceful and successful. Having said that, we appreciate the jury's time and effort. We really do. They spent an enormous amount of time during the trial listening. They were very intent. I mentioned at one point that some jurors, you have to wake them up by shouting or dropping a file. Not this juror. They listened. They took notes. They were as engaged as everybody else in the process, and it made for the type of verdict that we had to have, which was a verdict that listened to all available facts, not all of the facts, but all the available facts, the evidence, the law, and the timed consideration that the jury gave to it before making that final decision. Obviously, we are ecstatic with the results. George Zimmerman was never guilty of anything except protecting himself in self-defense. I'm glad that the jury saw it that way, and I hope that everyone who thinks, particularly those who doubted George's reasons and doubted his background, now understand that the jury knew everything that they knew was enough for them to find him not guilty. You know even more than the jury know about both parties' past, and we know that George was the type individual, from what you know, and his involvement in his community. This was not a unique event for George to try and be involved with his community and to be involved with the police when it was necessary. I'm just glad that the jury saw it that way. Very, very happy with the results.
Sometimes I can be a little more blunt. I think the prosecution of George Zimmerman was disgraceful. I am gratified by the jury's verdict as happy as I am for George Zimmerman, I'm thrilled that this jury kept this tragedy from becoming a travesty. For that, we are eternally grateful. But it makes me sad, too, that it took this long, under these circumstances, to finally get justice.
Sure, absolutely.
Thank you. Hi there, Amanda Evans, News 13. I have a question for you, Mr. West. This case became a little personal for you. There were some threats made to your family, some jabs about opening statements. We all watched as things kind of got heated between you and Judge Nelson. Can you talk about what this was like for you, this trial, these last few weeks, just personally?
Sure. Stop me if you've heard this one before. No, I'm not going to talk about that. No. This trial is about George Zimmerman, not about pictures of ice cream cones or... Now, I still think the joke was funny. I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry I didn't tell it better, but there was an important reason for it. There needed to be a disconnect, frankly, a disconnect from an act that was hard to follow. But I knew, Mr. O'Mara knew, and you all soon found out that it was indeed just an act. I couldn't follow that act with that kind of passion and glaring and staring and all of that. We needed facts. Unlike what Ms. Corey said, they brought the facts. They didn't. Anybody that watched this trial knew the defense put on the case. We proved George Zimmerman was not guilty. So, no, I won't talk about that. Thank you.
Yes.
Yes, sir. Ben Montgomery, Tampa Bay Times. Can you give us any insight into Mr. Zimmerman's state of mind upon hearing the verdict?
I don't know exactly how you can feel when you're in trauma and stress for 16 months. And he's very, very happy with the result, obviously. There's just a release that happens, an emotion release, and endorphin release, and adrenaline release. I think it's probably going to settle on him tonight when he's with his family and can actually realize that he doesn't need to come back to the courthouse tomorrow or ever again unless he wants to under his own free will. So I think he's going to be great. I think he's still worried. And hopefully everyone will respect the jury's verdict as they should, and most have said they would, and we'll take it day by day. But he's doing good.
This is Grace Wong with In Session. I know this is a yes or no question, but I want you to expand on it after I ask the question. Was this a fair fight for you?
Let me say it this way. I need to apologize to every public defender in the state. And for this reason, because I said that the way that we were treated in the discovery process and the fights that we had to go through in the discovery process made me think that maybe the prosecution thought they were dealing with a couple of young, overworked public defenders. And that insulted public defenders. Don West was one. I learned my craft from public defenders because when I was a prosecutor, that's who I learned from. So to the extent that there was some insult there, I apologize for it. What I meant to say was that it seemed as though the prosecution is used to getting away with some of what they got away with the enormous demands they put upon us to try and get discovery that in 30 years of experience, I've always gotten on the table right up front. So yes, it was a fight that we had to fight. They outfunded us. They made it extraordinarily difficult. If only we had the time back that it took us to fight for the stuff, the information, discovery, the just result that we had to fight for, this case might have been tried 6 months ago, and certainly I wouldn't have had the hundreds and hundreds of hours wasted in a situation where they never should have made us waste time. Was it fair? It was a little bit David and Goliath, but we won.
Danny Morales with the Valencia Voice here. George had a very good poker face on when the verdict came in. At what point did he express his gratitude to you and how excited he was to finally be able to go home?
I think per what we discussed with him beforehand, it was after everyone sort of left the room when you can actually show a little bit more emotions. You just, when you have an emotional outpouring like that, sometimes you get that on a camera or something like that. It's not really what you want to see. But he certainly thanked us, obviously, and I think he was able to finally emote as it became a realization that he truly is done.
Hi, Lisa Lucas, New York Daily News. I'd like to ask you what you feel was your best moment and your weakest moment, and ask the same of you to say that for the prosecution.
I think the best moment was when they said not guilty. I think that was probably the best moment right
Yep,
then.
I agree with that.
So that's it. And during the trial, if you haven't heard of trial hypnosis, I'll explain it to you. I absolutely believe that every time I opened my mouth, it was a great moment. Nobody else thought so, but I always did. So it was the whole. It's a trial. It's where we live. It's like a surgeon being in surgery. It's where you want to be. It's what you want to do. So I would. Everything that we did was with a purpose and a plan. Most of it worked out how we wanted. Every motion we filed, every argument we made. It's just what we do as decent trial lawyers.
Lisa Lampkin, NBC News.
Hello,
Mark, I
Lisa.
have a couple legal questions. One is, speaking about the state attorney's office, now that you've gotten the not guilty verdict you wanted, are you still going to pursue the sanctions, number one? And then second of all, hopefully not upsetting your wife, because I'm sure you're going to need a vacation, but how are you going to address the civil aspect of this now, as far as the stand your ground and keeping George Zimmerman from being liable?
Sure. As to the first, yes, there's a sanctions hearings to be set. There is not only that, but of course the state is then responsible for a lot of the costs that we've incurred to acquit George Zimmerman. So we're going to have a hearing on that as well. So yeah, we're not quite done yet. And on the civil aspect, if someone believes that it's appropriate to sue George Zimmerman, then we will seek and we will get immunity in a civil hearing. And we'll see just how many civil lawsuits are spawned from this fiasco. So,
Finn Gomez with Fox News. Mr. Romero, Mr. West, what happens to, I know this seems like a kind of a basic follow-up, but what happens now to Mr. Zimmerman? Are we going to hear from him? What does he do now? Where does he go? Like, what's next for your client?
I don't know what you do after 16 months of this. I'm really not sure. I think you need to just go somewhere, relax, get your bearings back. I think that he would like to, once he settles in, let you know who he really is, since that couldn't be told except through us, and even in that way, quite limited. But I'm sure that if he could wave his magic wand, he would just sort of get his life back. And I know that always brings up the idea of the life that's lost forever, and I'm not comparing the two, but now that the jury decided that he acted properly in self-defense, maybe we can give him a little bit of that understanding as well, that he now needs to get on with his life after having suffered several traumas.
Hello, sir.
Hi.
I have a two-part question, Molly Hennessy Fisk with the LA Times. The first part is the prosecution raised this question about whether the outcome would be different if the races of the defendant and the victim were different. Do you think it would have been different if George Zimmerman was black? And the other part of my question is, does he fear for his safety, have precautions been made surrounding his security?
Well, I think that the things would have been different if George Zimmerman was black for this reason. He never would have been charged with a crime. It seems as though what happened was an event that was being looked into by Sanford Police Department, and quite honestly, as we now know, looked into quite well. I have taken advantage of police departments who have not done a good investigation of crimes, because that's what I do for a living. When I looked at the Sanford Police Department investigation, they had done quite a good job, and you can compare what they did across the country to see who does good or bad jobs with their investigation, but they were doing quite a lot. What happened was this became a focus for a civil rights event, which again is a wonderful event to have, but they decided that George Zimmerman would be the person who they were to blame and sort of used as the creation of a civil rights violation, none of which was borne out by the facts. The facts that night was not borne out that he acted in a racial way. His history is a non-racist, and you know all the anecdotes about the mentees and the children living in his home when he was young and the Sherman Ware incident. So if only those who decide to condemn Mr. Zimmerman as quickly and as viciously as they did would have taken just a little bit of time to find out who it was that they were condemning, it would never have happened. And it certainly wouldn't have happened if he was black, because those people who decided that they were going to make him the scapegoat would not have.
What about safety?
And I'm sorry?
She can ask.
She did have a two-part question.
All right. I'll ask her question because I wanted to ask that too. First of all, is he, how concerned is he? Is he going to sort of stay in hiding for a while and sort of feel it out and see what happens? And then the second question is, I've never seen jurors thank defense attorneys for giving them instructions on the law before, as what happened to you during jury selection. My jaw dropped open. What was your reaction when they thanked you for explaining the law?
As to the first question, yes, he has to be very cautious and protective of his safety, because there is still a fringe element who have said, at least in tweets and everything else, that they want revenge, that they will not listen to a verdict of not guilty, although I think everyone in this room would agree this was a very fair trial. More fair to the state maybe on occasions than to the defense, but certainly it was a fair enough trial in that the state got to present everything that they could. So in that sense, those people who have their anger, they're just going to have it because they're angry people, not because it's based in fact. Can't help that, but we do need to be worried about it. Second question, I mentioned it earlier, everything I do I think is done well. I don't remember a juror actually verbalizing thank you to me when I'm trying to help them understand an area of law that, as we talked about, is utterly unique, and we drag them in off the street and ask them to take on our mantle of how we work our lives in these courtrooms and to do it well. But maybe I'll take that as a compliment that they were listening. And obviously, they got an opportunity to put that in practice with their verdict.
It's for Don West, Michael Lanos, HLN. You had to cross-examine Rachel Jeantel and Dr. Bao. Did you relish the challenge, or was it a nightmare?
No question it was a challenge. What I think we needed to establish with Ms. Jeantel, while it took several hours to accomplish, and there were those challenges within that itself, we showed through her testimony when the phone call, the second to last phone call ended with Trayvon Martin. What was it, 7/12/48, something like that, 7/11/48. And when the next one started, and then when the event itself occurred. Through that testimony, corroborated by the phone records, we could show, as Mr. O'Mara clearly pointed out in closing, there were 4 minutes. There were 4 minutes in between the time when Trayvon Martin ran off until he reappeared and the confrontation with George Zimmerman occurred. As well, the circumstances under which Ms. Jeantel was asked to answer questions were extraordinarily challenging for her. My goodness, she wanted to be left alone. She didn't volunteer anything until she was pulled out of this. And the first interview she gave was with the family lawyer, with the family present on the other end of the phone. It was an interview made for TV, not for law enforcement, that was then followed by an interview with the state attorney's office on April 2nd under the most extraordinary circumstances. It took place in Ms. Fulton's living room with Ms. Fulton sitting next to Ms. Jeantel. That set the stage for the witness herself saying, I was uncomfortable. I changed my testimony to really to accommodate the feelings of Ms. Fulton. That was the setting for all of this. Plus, as Mr. O'Mara pointed out, she really didn't want to be there. Was that a challenge? Of course it was. But I think ultimately, when you distill it to its important parts, that we did accomplish ultimately what we wanted. As to Dr. Bao, did you hear Dr. DeMaio's testimony? Much of my cross-examination of Dr. Bao was to set the stage for that, indicating where they would clearly disagree, trying to identify why and how they would disagree, and then offering, I think, perhaps the foremost expert in the country on the very issue we had in our case.
Hi, Valerie Boy, Fox 35 News. 2 questions. Do you think the judge was fair or unfair to you? And my other question is, do you think this verdict will hurt race relations?
Judge Nelson runs her courtroom very well, and she moved this case along at a pace that I appreciated. Obviously, we were asking for motions to continue along the way, not because of her timeline as much as because of the state's concerns over discovery. It turns out we were able to accomplish what we needed to in the time she gave us. Within the context of the courtroom herself, as I mentioned a couple of times, I appreciate that she reminds me when I do things like speaking objections or somehow no comes out of my mouth. And that's okay. She needs to run a strict courtroom. And I think that she did. So I sort of appreciate that. And I'm okay with that. We certainly had some concerns over the rulings as they occurred, but we respect them as the rulings they are. You had a second part to that?
Do you think this verdict will affect race relations?
I kept saying a year ago that I really hope that they don't. I kept suggesting to Mr. Crump on 3 separate occasions that we not suggest that this is a civil rights case of the century, because it's just not. It was a self-defense case. Did it bring to the forefront the conversation that young black males are treated a certain way in the criminal justice system? Absolutely. Is that positive? Absolutely. Do we need to have that conversation? Absolutely. However, if portending that conversation on top of the Zimmerman verdict is going to affect our ability to have that conversation, shame on them, because that conversation needs to be had. And now it may not be had because we have sort of artificially separated the two camps, if you will, over this verdict. This verdict still has nothing to do with civil rights. Civil rights needs to be talked about, but not in the context of the George Zimmerman verdict.
George Howell with CNN. This question specifically to you, Mr. West. As far as the relationship with the judge, the back and forth, can you talk to us just a bit about that? Do you feel that you were getting fair treatment? And a second question that's similar to both of you. What do you say regarding the tension? What do you tell people who've dug in on one side or the other?
I'd like to keep my bar license for a couple more years. And the second part of the question?
The second part of the question was, what do you tell people? This has become, people have watched around the country and have dug in on either side of this. What do you tell people, just given the tension that could follow this verdict?
That's been such a challenge for me. Obviously, while I've tried a number of cases over the last 33 years or so, a number of them with extremely high stakes, death penalty cases. Nothing, of course, like this with the media attention. Nothing that had the case tried over and over and over again in the media. Nothing where the media was accused of such irresponsibility early on, frankly, being swept along with this narrative that's simply been shown not to be true. To me, as a trial lawyer, that was an incredible distraction, because I like to, in fact, the only place I can try a case is in the courtroom, and I think we did that. So I don't know how to respond.
Yes.
Jackie Goddard for the Times of London and the Daily Beast. You mentioned about George wanting to get his life back. There's one person who's not going to. Have you got any words for Trayvon Martin's family?
They suffered a tragedy. I've acknowledged that to the family on 3 previous occasions. Nothing can bring back Trayvon Martin. Every time any life is lost, particularly a young life, it's a tragedy. We hear about it in car accidents. We hear about it with cancer. I lost a 13-year-old niece to cancer. We hear about it constantly, and it's always a tragedy. But I'm not going to shy away from the fact that I think that the evidence supported that George Zimmerman did nothing wrong, and that he was battered and beaten by a 17-year-old who, for whatever reason, and we won't know, thought that he had to lash out and attack violently. And it turned out that all of the forensic evidence supports that. None of it supports that George was ever the aggressor, certainly not legally, and I don't believe morally. So did that end up leading to the tragic loss of life? Yes. Could it have been avoided? Yes. When it really came down to it, 45 seconds before the gunshot, when George was getting battered, I still believe that that decision was in Trayvon Martin's hands more than my client's. And as I mentioned, I they get my greatest sympathies for their tragic loss of their son. No one should ever have to suffer losing a child, ever. But it happens much more than we're willing to acknowledge sometimes or that we want to admit. This is a tragedy like many other loss of children. It's just not one that George was responsible for.
Ty Wright, Valencia Voice. When the jury asked for clarification on the instructions regarding manslaughter, was there any nervousness between you guys and George that he would be facing the lesser charges?
My understanding was that they were confused by a confusing jury instruction. I said to the judge, Mr. West first argued one day, and before I started my closing the next day, that the manslaughter instruction is very confusing. I don't want to get into the legal part of it, and I know you don't, but if you look at it, justifiable homicide is identified within manslaughter, excusable homicide is identified within manslaughter, and somewhere separate is justifiable use of deadly force. If you try and read those, they are logically inconsistent, but not legally inconsistent. And I think that jury, as smart as they are, because they were thinking, looked at it and said, why are you telling us about excusable homicide? It's just that we had to, even though it had no application to the facts of this case. So, sure.
Hi. Hi. Yami Shalsunder with USA Today. Don West, you said that I am thrilled that this jury kept this tragedy from becoming a travesty. Can you talk about what the tragedy you're talking about? We talked about civil rights issues here, people not falsely or wrongly linking it to race. Could you just tell me a little bit more what you mean by that tragedy into a travesty?
The tragedy is the loss of Trayvon Martin's life in every respect. Regardless of what he was doing or immediately what led up to it, it's a tragic loss of life. It not only will impact, of course, Trayvon Martin's family and all those that knew him forever and ever. This event itself also impacts George Zimmerman forever and ever and ever. This is something no one gets over. There's no winners here. There's no monsters here. That's the tragedy. The travesty, it would have been a travesty of justice had George Zimmerman been convicted. That's the travesty.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate the time. I think that was, someone said it was the last question, so.
And we are watching the defense attorneys for George Zimmerman on this night in which a jury has given its verdict of not guilty in the George Zimmerman murder trial. A couple of things to watch out for on your screen. Don West and Mark O'Mara taking questions. We showed you first the prosecution's response and now the defense team's response to the verdict this evening that their client, George Zimmerman, is not guilty, not of second-degree murder, not of manslaughter. The jury of 6 women making that decision earlier this evening. And this case had huge implications across the country. It has so politically and racially divided the nation in many ways. But tonight, justice is served in America because the justice that we look for comes from a jury, and that jury has rendered its verdict. We're still watching and listening. This is Mark O'Mara. Let's listen in.
For 45 seconds. And then a man who believes in the system, whose dad was a judge, who maybe wanted to be a cop or a prosecutor, then gets a system. 2 systems went against George Zimmerman that he can't understand. You guys, the media, he was like a patient in an operating table where mad scientists were committing experiments on him and he had no anesthesia. He didn't know why he was turned into this monster, but quite honestly, you guys had a lot to do with it. You just did, because you took a story that was fed to you and you ran with it and you ran right over him. And that was horrid to him. Then he comes into a system that he trusts. Let's not forget, 6 voluntary statements, voluntary surrender. And he believes in a system that he really wanted to be part of, right? And then he gets prosecutors that charge him with a crime they could never, ever prove. It's not like they didn't lose evidence along the way, right? So I don't think anyone would argue with me in this room that they had evidence of second-degree murder. This in-your-heart kind of stuff, that's not what we're supposed to do, and it's not what they're supposed to do. So those 2 systems failed him.
Thank you.
Thanks.